I was terrified at the end of the first quarter. As a Michigan fan, it felt like the walls were closing in, and it felt like all Ohio State needed was one big play. One big play to open up the can of worms, to have the crowd fully vested in the game, and to have Michigan begin to fall apart. JJ McCarthy failed to complete 50% of his passes at the end of the first quarter. Michigan didn't even run for more than one rushing yard at the end of the first quarter. And Ohio State, it felt like they were up by 3 or 4 touchdowns, but because of some dropped passes, including Marvin Harrison Jr.'s first drop of the season, because of an awkward play call on 4th and 2, I know Michigan blitzed, but I think if Ohio State ran the football on that 4th down, they would have converted it, and it could have ended differently, but it is what it is. And great defense, both on that 4th down stop by Michigan and beginning late in the first quarter and for the rest of the game, Michigan's defense no longer looked lost. They looked sound. They played an excellent bend but don't break scheme, just like they did last year, and it worked to perfection. But we didn't know that at the end of the first quarter. But when the first quarter ended and the ad break came, that was a fluke. That was a mirage. That first quarter didn't prepare the world, didn't prepare Ohio State or Michigan fans or myself for what was about to come. Because what was about to come was JJ McCarthy, Cornelius Johnson, Donovan Edwards, Taylor Upshaw, Makari Page, any player who made a big, momentous play, burrowing into Ohio State's being and scoring them, or outscoring them rather, 42-13 in the remaining 3 quarters of play. The 28-3 scoring margin in the second half is the most important one. Michigan is the ultimate second half team. Many people have said, and not just about Michigan, but period, you have to play a full 4 quarters of college football to, win the national title or be an elite team. Michigan does that. But what people don't realize is they play an elite second half and an average, maybe below average at worst, but a below average to a good first half. And then they completely crank it up in the second half. They take you in, they chew you up, and they spit you out like a cherry. They take it in, they chew up all the good parts, suck out all the juice and the skin, and they spit out the pit. That's what Michigan does in the second half. That's absolutely what they do to teams. They've done it to everyone all year except Illinois, and they still beat Illinois. They still clutched up. This Michigan team is physically, mentally, they're tough in every area. They have, after today, the number 1 head coach in the Big Ten. They have the number 1 defensive coordinator in the Big Ten, and their offensive staff, look, for all the criticism they received that was rightfully given before this game, they opened up the playbook. They targeted deep. Cornelius Johnson on 4 receptions had 160 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. Michigan's wide receivers had a better matchup against Ohio State's defensive backs than Ohio State's wide receivers, who were all NFL players, had against our secondary. And a lot of it was scheming. When Ohio State had 0 blitzes, when they forced blitzes, JJ McCarthy stayed calm and poised, delivered deep balls, or on Cornelius Johnson's first receiving touchdown, he just delivered the ball like 10 yards down the field to Cornelius Johnson. And through busted tackles and the fact that when you blitz everyone, you have no safety help, Cornelius Johnson just had to run and keep his feet up, keep his back straight, and just keep his hips moving. And being that Cornelius Johnson has had talk in the preseason of being a first or second round wide receiver by some, but at least an NFL wide receiver, he did all those things. Donovan Edwards, 22 carries for 216 yards and 2 TDs. He had a 75-yard TD run and an 85-yard touchdown run as Michigan's last 14 points scored to close out the game. Nothing prepared me for that. And I Wasn't necessarily doubting my own team like I did last year. Last year, I didn't give my team any chance to win despite predicting it would be close. I thought my team had a chance to win, but I still picked Ohio State. I picked them 31-27, and I was dead wrong. Dead wrong. Michigan once again was better in the red zone. Michigan was better on all sides of the football field. Michigan had the better quarterback. They had the better running back. They had the better offensive center, the better offensive guards, the better tackle, the better tight ends, the better wide receivers. They had the better defensive tackles, defensive ends, the better linebackers, the better safeties, corners. They had the better punter. Maybe Ohio State had the better kicker because they went 3 of 3 and Michigan's Jake Moody went 1 of 2. But if you're better in every other area of the field, that really doesn't matter. And Jake Moody is still good, and Jake Moody missed that 57-yarder because it was from 57 yards. It's a hard kick to make. Michigan was the better team. If Michigan rematched and played this game again, they would win, just like last year. 22-point margin of victory compared to last year's 15-point margin of victory. Michigan's first win in Columbus since 2000. And from a Michigan fan standpoint, this is awesome. This is absolutely awesome. And this video would be different if I made it entirely from a Michigan fan standpoint. I'd be jumping up and down. I'd be yelling in my microphone. I'd be saying different things. And I would be telling you that Ohio State stinks and that Michigan owns Ohio State. But this isn't the case. These are two elite football teams. I completely believe that. I mean, CJ Stroud, Michigan's defense is good. And after today, they might be the number 1 defense in the country. He had an off game. He's at home. He looked like he was playing on the road, and his wide receivers dropped some footballs. This wasn't Ohio State's best game. This was Michigan's best game. It wasn't Ohio State's best game. Now, in my opinion, after watching the game, the 118th edition of it, I think that even if both teams played their A-plus game, Michigan would still win by double digits, especially at a neutral site, and especially if they played in Ann Arbor. Michigan, after this game, I think deserves that number 1 spot. They beat the number 2 team on the road by 22 points. They're the ultimate second half team. They are elite. They play an elite brand of football that is unlike anything we have seen this year in the second half, minus that Illinois game. And even then, they were still clutch. They still did enough to win. There's a reason they're 12-0 and 9-0 in conference. This is Michigan's best regular season ever. Michigan's never had a 12-win regular season. They've never won 12 regular season games. The last time they were undefeated in the regular season was 1997, when they had 11 regular season games. And they didn't have 9 conference games. It's the best regular season Michigan has had in its history. Michigan football is peaking. And Michigan as a team in 2022 is constantly peaking. They play their best football toward the end, which is why when my team, the Wolverines, were down by 3 at the half, I had some confidence. I told my dad when it was either Michigan led or Michigan was down by 4 or maybe 3. I forget, not 4, but 7. Either 7 or 3 points, or maybe they were up. Maybe it was after that Cornelius Johnson touchdown. I think it was before, though. I said, depending on Michigan's play in the second quarter, defensively, if they can be within single digits of Ohio State entering halftime, I have a lot of confidence, because Michigan is a second half team, and they've been that consistently. And today they proved it. Ohio State, on the other hand, is also a second half team. Now, Michigan makes better adjustments overall and plays a better second half than Ohio State does. But Ohio State before this game looked like the better team. They had the better resume, and they played a better first half. This didn't matter at all. Michigan outscored them 28-3 and rushed for more than 200 yards in that second half. They had poor play calling, and they failed to adjust. They looked broken. They looked frustrated. When G. Scott Jr. had that unsportsmanlike along with the holding. That's a game-changing foul. And the false start that happened on that same drive when CJ Stroud played well, got his team within 5 yards of the first down, and Ohio State was about to go for it. And then a false start. Ohio State punts it. Michigan punts it. I think Ohio State punts it again. Or I don't know how that worked, but eventually Michigan got down the field. They chewed nearly 8 minutes of clock, and they scored a touchdown. And that breaks teams. Michigan broke Ohio State today. And they beat Penn State, who's a top 10 team. They beat them 41-17 at home. They beat Ohio State 45-23 on the road. They beat their arch rival, Michigan State. They're 12-0. I mean, they're a great team. And Ohio State is a great team, too. They're 11-1. Their one loss is to who I think is now the number one team in the country. And they dominated Penn State, too, who's a top 10 team. They dominated Notre Dame at the end. It's a top 25 team. They're a good football team. In fact, I'd say Ohio State is an elite football team, or at worst, a great football team. But the Wolverines are the much better football team this year. They're the much better team. No questions asked. Michigan was 7 of 16 on third down, where Ohio State was 5 of 16. Michigan was 1-on-1 on fourth down. Ohio State was 0 of 1. Michigan averaged 11.1 yards per pass and had no picks. And Ohio State had 2 picks and averaged 7.3 yards per pass on 48 attempts compared to Michigan's 25 attempts. JJ McCarthy only completed 50% of his passes, yes, but the majority of his completions were insane. I mean, if you look at his completions and what the wide receivers did, and Michigan's wide receivers averaged 21.4 yards per reception. That's crazy. That's like Ohio State from last year in the Rose Bowl against Utah. And Michigan doesn't have the same first-round talent at wide receiver. JJ McCarthy is still unpolished. He was inaccurate at times. In the first quarter especially, and in the first half, he's still unpolished. He's just a sophomore, and he's a great player. He's still unpolished, though. He's not what CJ Stroud is on a consistent basis, but he outplayed CJ Stroud today and was the better quarterback. Ohio State started off strong, and they had nearly 100 rushing yards at the half, or around 100. Michigan didn't even have 50. But in that second half, Michigan put together their on-the-ground game. Donovan Edwards had a 75-yard rushing touchdown and an 85-yard rushing touchdown to close out everything. Michigan ran for 252 yards. They had 7.2 yards per rush, compared to Ohio State's 143 rushing yards and 4.9 yards per rush. Michigan ran for 3 touchdowns, 1 by JJ McCarthy and 2 by Donovan Edwards. McCarthy had 4 total TDs, which is a career high for him. Michigan had only 5 penalties for 30 yards, a lot of them false starts. Ohio State had 9 penalties for 91 yards. Ohio State actually led in TOP, 31 minutes and 46 seconds compared to Michigan's 28 minutes and 14 seconds. What can I say? Michigan, 45, Ohio State, 23. And as we get into the ramifications part, Ohio State fans, what do you think of Ryan Day and Jim Knowles? What do you think? They're the offensive and defensive play callers here. Look, Jim Knowles, it's year 1. I'm not going to give him too much slack. The defense is still much better than last year's unit. And if you're saying, well, Michigan with their poverty offense scored 45. No, absolutely not. Michigan has a better O-line than they did last year. They have better running backs than they did last year. Their tight end room is overall deeper. And they have the better quarterback than last year and the better wide receivers. You faced a much superior offense compared to last year's Michigan team, and you faced a better defense. These are truths. These are, in fact, axioms of college football. It's not that Jim Knowles is a bad DC, or that Ryan Day is even, a terrible play caller, though I'd argue after today his play calling is certainly questionable. Jim Knowles is in year 1, and he faced an amazing offense. He faced an elite offense, an offense that, isn't as consistent as Ohio State's, but when it mattered, It played at an elite level. So what do you think of Jim Knowles and Ryan Day? I think the calls for firing Ryan Day are asinine. It's painful, but he won 11 games in the regular season, and I have to be honest with you, I think that Ohio State still has a very good shot at making the college football playoff, and I think that they are better than USC. I think they're a top 4 team. But what do you think? What do you think Ryan Day needs to do for you to like him and for you to put up with him? And I ask it in that way because I know Ohio State fans are used to dominating Michigan. And if you go 11-1 and your one loss is to Michigan, at Ohio State, that's terrible. If Michigan goes 11-1 but lost to Ohio State today, there'd be grumblings about Jim Harbaugh, but not at the level of the grumblings that are going on about Ryan Day and Ohio State. Not at that same level. It's different there. And it's different not because Ohio State treats football better than Michigan. It's different because Ohio State's been used to dominance. And when you're used to dominance and then go 0-2 and you lose, you get dominated by your rival, it's painful. So, what do you think of Ryan Day? Do you think he needs to hire an OC? Go out and get Garrett Riley from TCU. Have him call the plays. He'll call better plays. He'll still utilize the run game. And the passing game will probably be better called and be even more explosive. Just look at what TCU's done with Max Duggan in that run game. And just look at what Garrett Riley's done at TCU. It's just an idea. And for Jim Knowles, it's year 1. What he's done in 1 year is very impressive. You got to give him more time than just one flippin' year. You have to. Anyway, I digress. Let's get to the ramifications. Even without Blake Corum, Michigan's run game dominated and closed out the game. Corum had 2 carries for 6 yards. His Heisman race is over. He's not winning it. There's a chance Stroud wins it, but with a loss today, I doubt it. It's basically it's Caleb Williams to lose, if we're being honest here. And this might be a very weak Heisman selection. I look at what Bo Nix has done at Oregon and just the comeback that he has had, and I think that Bo Nix at this point, it should be between Bo Nix and Caleb Williams, if we're being honest here. I mean, you could, have CJ Stroud win it. Maybe if Blake Corum is healthy in Indy and pops off for 200 yards and a few TDs, you could have him win it. Or, I don't know at this point. But even without him, Michigan as a football team, as a unit, are bigger than one player, which it didn't look like that against Illinois. But they killed that narrative, and that's very important. Not just from, a college football and contender standpoint, but from a culture standpoint too, in the locker room. And as a Michigan fan, you want to know that your team can do well and play at an elite level without what is presumed to be your best player, and I think is Michigan's best player. The passing game was completely and utterly explosive and fascinating. Now, it wasn't perfect. Michigan barely completed over 50% of their passes. It was a very hit and miss pass game. But it wasn't boom or bust. In fact, boom or miss would have been the accurate term. Michigan had no turnovers. They were either incompletions or big plays, which is totally fine. JJ McCarthy hit the deep ball when needed. In fact, he threw 2 accurate deep balls. Not completely perfect. The one to Cornelius Johnson was a little behind him. He had to slow down, but I'd say that would be like a 9 out of 10 throw or a 9.5 out of 10 throw. Basically close to a perfect ball. The one to Colston Loveland was a 10 out of 10. He threw the deep ball when necessary. He made great throws. His first quarter play, that once the first quarter was over, he shook off all the rust and he was amazing. He averaged 11 yards per pass against Ohio State, against a top 10 defense. When has that happened to Ohio State ever? Like maybe since Baker Mayfield in 2017? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. If you have an answer to that, tell me. But JJ McCarthy outplayed CJ Stroud. He looked more polished in the pocket. JJ McCarthy also used his running element, which CJ Stroud, mind you, he can run, but he didn't use it. He had what, like one rush for 5 yards, and then I think he was sacked for 8 yards or something. Yeah, he was sacked for 8 yards. So he didn't even break positive yardage. He had -3 rushing yards. McCarthy, 27 rushing yards, 4.5 yards per carry. He had a long of 19, and he had a 3-yard rushing touchdown on 3rd and goal. He was clutch. He looked like a Heisman quarterback. For granted, the first time all season, while CJ Stroud has looked like a Heisman candidate in every other game, minus Northwestern, but in the biggest game, McCarthy outplayed Stroud. And Jesse Minter deserves the Broyles Award. His defense has been elite all year, and they shut down the number 1 offense. They held them to 23 points. Michigan held Ohio State to 27 points last year. Michigan played a more balanced Ohio State offense, an offense that is similar to last year's, a little worse in the passing element, a little better in the rushing element and tight end area. Definitely they have a better O-line, and Michigan held them to 23 points. They held them to only 2 touchdowns and 3 field goals. Michigan, meanwhile, scored 6 touchdowns and kicked a field goal by Jake Moody. Minter deserves the Broyles Award. You know, Michigan, they go out in Indy, and let's just say, you know, they beat Purdue, who's leading 24-10 right now at the time of this recording. You know, they beat Purdue like by 40, which is very likely a possibility. They're 13-0. He should get the Broyles Award. Honestly, this is a top 2 defense. It's between Michigan and Georgia to who has the best defense in the nation, at least statistically. If we're talking about actuality and factoring in offensive play, Michigan's defense is top 3. It would be between them, Iowa, and Georgia. But Minter, certainly with all the losses on defense, he certainly deserves the Broyles Award. Ryan Day, on the other hand, let's talk about the other side of the play calling. His play calling was confusing. That 4th and 2, you have a competent O-line. You have a good O-line. In fact, Ohio State was the more physical team in the first half, the entire first half. Now, Michigan was the more explosive team in the first half. In the first half, if you put a blindfold on both teams, I would have thought Michigan was Ohio State and Ohio State was Michigan, just by the way both played. Michigan was passing the ball better, making explosive NFL throws, catches, running NFL routes, but they couldn't run the football. Ohio State, on the other hand, was running it physically and doing short to medium passes, but overall driving up and down the field better than Michigan was. But his play calling was confusing. That 4th and 2, Cade Stover, granted, was open and he could have caught that, but with your O-line and the way that you were running it with Chip Trainium, who reminds me of Hassan Haskins, you're not going to tackle him behind the line of scrimmage very easily. Why don't you run it? You've been forcing the run all year, trying to instill mental toughness, instilling physicality, bringing Ohio State back to a team who can run the football. Run it on 4th and 2. But no, it had to be a pass, and it had to be a dropped pass, more specifically. A dropped pass. And that was just one of them. Ohio State, from what I watched, sort of gave up on the run after the second half. After the first half, pardon me. After halftime. They gave up the run. And that was a gift to Michigan because Michigan was defending the pass decently. And they defended it very well at an elite level in the second half. But when Ohio State ran it, got that play action game going, they could also pass against Michigan and it worked well. But I don't know. You know, Ryan Day's play calling has given Michigan momentum time and time again. Last year, opening drive, you're down by 1 against Michigan. They run it for 3 times, punt it, and then Michigan scores. And at that point, the snowball effect occurs. This year, Ohio State, they fail to make adjustments, both offensively and defensively. After halftime, Ohio State just completely fell apart. Just after all of that, Michigan, they get the ball to start the third quarter. And that's the Colston Loveland 45-yard touchdown. Then Ohio State, they try and run it. They try to continue to run it, but it just doesn't work as well. And then, you know what? It just falls apart. They punt it. There's a game of back and forth punts, and then Michigan eventually they start scoring and scoring, and Ohio State begins to wear down and break down. But the play calling was honestly confusing, and the execution was even more confusing. Ohio State didn't execute it at a high level. They started off fast, but they completely fell apart in the third quarter. Completely. They fell flat on their face, and it hurt. It obviously hurt them. You could tell at the end of that third quarter and the beginning of the fourth, you could hear the anxiety in the crowd on that when, Michigan, they were saved by a defensive pass interference call where I think it was Ronnie Hickman interfered with Ronnie Bell. And then it was 3rd and goal from the 3, and you could hear the anxiety in the crowd and the anger. And that's when JJ McCarthy ran it in for 3 yards. And that's when Michigan went up 31-20. They fell apart. CJ Stroud drives down the field, and they should have scored a TD after Emeka Egbuka had that huge reception. But they kicked a field goal, Donovan Edwards ran it, and at that point you basically knew the game was over. They couldn't stop Michigan in the second half or in the second quarter. They could only stop them in the first quarter. If this Ohio State team wanted to beat this Michigan team, they had to start faster and then hold on to their lead and hope that Michigan just couldn't catch up quickly enough. And the play calling did not help that at all, offensively or defensively. All those zero blitzes, it reminded me, you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of Don Brown. That's what it reminded me of. It totally reminded me of Don Brown sending more people than the opposing offensive line could block. But the problem was that Ohio State, when Don Brown was Michigan's DC, Ohio State had a quarterback who could be calm in the pocket, throw the throws, and let his wide receivers make plays. And that's what Michigan did today to Ohio State and Columbus. I want to end off on this note, though. These are both top 4 teams, and I would love to see a rematch for it all, which is very possible. If Notre Dame beats USC tonight, I can guarantee you that Ohio State will be in the college football playoff as very likely the 4th seed, because TCU, they could lose, but there's a good chance they'll go 13-0. Georgia, I definitely see them going 13-0, though with their struggles with Georgia Tech, you never know. Though I think that's more of a look-ahead game to LSU, similarly to how Michigan's close win over Illinois was in comparison to Ohio State. But you never know. It's all about every given Saturday. Every given Saturday, there are no guarantees. You play the games. That's why these power metrics and all these different things in analytics, they're good. They're helpful. But they don't tell the full story. They don't. But these are top 4 teams, both of them. I think Michigan's number 1. Ohio State is number 4. That would be, in my opinion, after watching today's game, that would be my opinion. I still think Ohio State's better than USC, whether USC wins out or not. But if USC does win out, the committee will give them that spot with how bad Ohio State's home loss was and the fact that USC is a conference champion and Ohio State isn't. But I'd love to see these 2 teams rematch. They're both well coached overall. They're both elite teams. They both have elite offenses. Ohio State has a great defense that's up and coming that does have a high upside to it, and Michigan has possibly the best defense in the country. These are both great teams. This is the greatest rivalry in all of college football. And to Ohio State fans, good game. I honestly thought that my team was going to lose again in Columbus. And thankfully, Jim Harbaugh, JJ McCarthy, Mike Morris, and that entire Michigan locker room proved me wrong. That's all I'm going to say for this video. If you liked it, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and comment your thoughts on this video down below. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around. Bye-bye.